The CNN studio lights blaze hot as Mark Levin's voice echoed through the building, his thick New York accent cutting through the tension. Like a blade, you don't know what you're talking about, he shouted, pointing directly at Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Across the debate table, the 70-year-old conservative radio legend's face was flushed with fury, his hands trembling as he gripped his notes. But what happened next stunned everyone in the room. Crockett, the 43-year-old Texas Democrat, who had endured Levin's verbal assault for 10 relentless minutes, slowly reached into her briefcase. The camera zoomed in as she pulled out a familiar red, white, and blue book. Levin's eyes widened in horror as he recognized it was his own work staring back at him. "Mr. Levin," she said with a calm smile that sent a chill through the studio, "since you want to lecture me about the Constitution, let's see what you really wrote in your own book." The room fell. Dead silent. Anderson Cooper's jaw dropped. The camera operators froze. This was no longer just a political debate. This was about to become the most devastating takedown in cable news history. Mark Levin had walked into the studio thinking he would steamroll yet another Democrat with decades of constitutional expertise and media authority. But he was about to find out that some fights can't be won, especially when your opponent has receipts and has done her homework. The stage was set, the battle lines drawn, and Jasmine Crockett was about to use Mark Levin's own words to destroy him live on air. To understand the magnitude of this moment, you need to know who these two were and why their clash mattered so deeply. Mark Levin was one of conservative media's most influential voices at 70. He had built a multi-decade empire. His radio program, The Mark Levin Show, reached millions across America. He had authored multiple bestsellers on the Constitution, liberty, and conservative values. To his followers, he was known as the Great One, a name that reflected his towering status in Republican politics. He had cut his political teeth working under Ronald Reagan and had been waging ideological battles since before. Crockett was bored. His command of constitutional law was legendary among conservatives. When Levin spoke about the founding documents, millions listened, but it wasn't just his knowledge that made him dangerous. It was his presentation style. When Levin got angry, he didn't debate, he dominated. His show was built on overwhelming guests with machine gun bursts of constitutional references, obscure court cases, and quotes from founding fathers. His opponents often couldn't respond before he moved in to question their intelligence, education, and even their legitimacy to participate in the conversation. He had done it so many times and so effectively that many Democrats simply avoided him. Just 6 months earlier, he had verbally shredded a veteran Democratic senator during a Fox News segment on immigration. 3 weeks before this debate, he embarrassed a progressive law professor on national television with the same aggressive barrage. His tactics worked, and his audience loved it. His debate clips routinely went viral under titles like "Mark Levin obliterates socialist professor," and "The Great One dismantles liberal senator." For many conservatives, he wasn't just a commentator, he was an intellectual warrior. But tonight, he wasn't facing just anyone. Jasmine Crockett was no ordinary Democrat at 43. She represented everything the Republican old guard feared. She was young, black, fearless, and fiercely prepared. She didn't come from political royalty. She had fought her way into Congress after earning a law degree, building a successful legal career, and defeating establishment figures along the way. Her experience as a civil rights attorney taught her one lesson above all preparation is power. Unlike many politicians who relied on talking points, Crockett studied her opponents in surgical detail. She read their books, memorized their contradictions, watched every past interview and debate. When she stepped into the arena, she didn't bring opinions. She brought evidence. This debate was personal. It wasn't just about voting rights. It was a showdown between old conservative power and rising progressive strength, between a white male media titan and a black female Congresswoman. CNN had brought them together to debate a controversial voting rights bill tearing Washington apart. Levin claimed it was unconstitutional federal overreach. Crockett argued it was essential to preserving democracy, but the tension between them had been building for months. Levin had mocked her on his radio show repeatedly, calling her a radical who didn't understand the Constitution. He questioned her intelligence and called her a puppet for progressives. While Crockett stayed silent publicly, she was preparing privately, reading every book Levin had ever published, marking every contradiction, every weak point she could find. The CNN studio that night was filled with political insiders, journalists, and activists. Everyone expected Levin to dominate. Even the betting odds in Washington favored the Great One. Anderson Cooper tried to keep the debate civil, but the tension was crackling before a single word was exchanged. These two didn't just disagree, they despised each other. As the cameras rolled, Levin came out swinging, attacking Crockett's legal credentials and hammering her with his booming voice, trying to overwhelm her like he had done with so many others for 10 minutes. It looked like he was succeeding. Crockett barely got a word in the script, seemed to be playing out exactly as predicted, but what no one realized was that Crockett was letting Levin dig his own grave. Every accusation, every amendment he cited, every Supreme Court precedent he referenced, she stored away, calmly waiting for the moment to strike. The briefcase at her side didn't just contain notes, it held Levin's own books, meticulously bookmarked and highlighted. With damning contradictions, the first crack in Levin's armor came when his tone shifted from passionate to furious. Congresswoman Crockett, he barked, leaning forward, you clearly don't understand the fundamental principles of federalism. This bill is a direct violation of the 10th Amendment. Anderson Cooper tried to intervene, asking him to let her respond, but Levin was too far gone. His radio persona had taken over, Vane's bulging voice rising as he snapped, I've listened to her spout progressive talking points for 10 minutes. Someone needs to educate this woman on what the founders actually intended. Behind the scenes, CNN staff were frantically gesturing to Cooper. The debate was spiraling into chaos, and social media was already ablaze with clips of Levin's meltdown. What they didn't know was this was exactly what Crockett had planned. She had studied Levin's every debate. She knew that when he got angry, he got reckless, and when he got reckless, he made mistakes her training in law had taught her that the most crushing victories come when your opponent thinks they're winning right until the moment you drop the hammer. And now, as she slowly opened that briefcase and pulled out his book, she was about to do just that. Levin had no idea what was coming, and in the next few minutes his legacy would face its most devastating challenge. Yet live on national television, the trap she had carefully constructed using his own published words was now fully in motion, and the studio audience gasped in disbelief. Even by cable news standards, it was shocking to hear a sitting congresswoman referred to as this woman in such a blatantly dismissive way. Several audience members began murmuring their discomfort and outrage, but Jasmine Crockett's expression remained perfectly composed, her calm exterior unshaken, while her eyes burned with fire that made the camera operators instinctively zoom. And she was not intimidated. She was waiting. And when she finally spoke, her voice was low and steady. Mr. Levin, I appreciate your passion for constitutional law, but perhaps we should discuss what the Constitution actually says rather than what you think it says. That one sentence was all it took for Mark Levin to completely unravel what I think it says. He roared, rising from his seat. Lady, I've been studying constitutional law since before you were born. I worked in the Reagan administration. I've written 5 best-selling books on constitutional principles. Don't you dare lecture me about what the Constitution says. The studio went utterly silent except for the heavy sound of Levin's breath echoing through the tense air. Anderson Cooper looked visibly concerned, trying to maintain order while security personnel moved slightly closer in anticipation. But Crockett didn't flinch. She simply smiled, that same disarming yet unsettling smile that had frozen the room earlier. 5 books, she repeated slowly, as if committing the number to memory. That's impressive, Mr. Levin. I've actually read them all. Levin straightened up his confidence, quickly returning, good, then you should understand why this voting rights bill is completely unconstitutional. Oh, I understand your current position perfectly, Crockett replied with her voice still maddeningly calm. What I'm curious about is how you reconcile that position with some of your previous writings. For the first time since the debate began, a flicker of doubt passed across Levin's face. What are you talking about? He asked. Well, since you brought up your books, perhaps we should talk about what you actually wrote in them, Crockett said as she reached toward her briefcase. The cameras caught Levin's eyes dart toward the briefcase, then quickly back to her face, and in that brief glance something in his posture shifted. His supreme confidence cracked ever so slightly. I stand by everything I've written, he said, but the force of his voice had dulled. I'm sure you do. Crockett nodded. And that's exactly what makes this so interesting. She opened her briefcase with slow, precise movements like a trial attorney presenting key evidence, and the cameras focused on her hands as she drew out a book. It was his 2013 bestseller, Liberty and Tyranny, a cornerstone of conservative ideology. But this wasn't some fresh copy from the shelf. This book was worn, filled with highlights and tabs sticking out in every direction, a battlefield of notes taken by someone who had studied every word. Levin's face turned pale. Anderson Cooper tried to interject. Congresswoman, what exactly are you doing? Well, Anderson, Crockett said, without breaking eye contact with Levin, Mr. Levin has spent the last 15 minutes lecturing me on constitutional principle. He's questioned my education, my intelligence, and my legal understanding, and he's pointed his own books as proof of his authority. So I thought it might be educational for the public to hear what Mr. Levin actually wrote on the subject of federal voting oversight, specifically what he wrote in 2013 when a Republican was president. The blood drained from Levin's face's mouth open, but no sound followed. Crockett continued. Flipping to a bookmarked page, I've done something that apparently few others have. I read all of Mr. Levin's books, every one of them, and I found some very interesting contradictions. Levin tried to push back Congresswoman. You're taking things out of context, and my Crockett snapped her voice sharp now for the first time. Let's find out. Then she opened the book to a clearly highlighted passage and began reading in a steady, commanding voice that filled the entire studio. The federal government has not only the right but the obligation to ensure that all citizens have equal access to the voting process. State governments that implement discriminatory practices must be held accountable by federal oversight, as this represents the very foundation of our democratic republic. What followed was a silence so intense it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Levin's mouth hung open. Anderson Cooper stared at the book in visible disbelief. Even the camera crew seemed frozen in place. That, Crockett said firmly, snapping the book shut, is a direct quote from page 20. The very same federal oversight you just spent the last 20 minutes calling unconstitutional. Levin's hands remained still, and the battle that he thought he'd come to win was now clearly slipping away from him. The trap she had carefully constructed using his own published words was now beginning to close around him, and the studio audience collectively gasped, not just in surprise, but in recognition of what was unfolding before them. Even by cable news standards, this moment stood apart, shocking and raw. Calling a sitting Congresswoman, this woman, in such a cold, dismissive tone, pierced through the air like an insult aimed not just at her, but at every woman watching from home. Murmurs of disbelief spread to the audience like ripples in still water. But Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat unmoved, her face the picture of composure, yet her eyes betrayed a fire sharp enough to cut through steel. The camera operators, sensing the moment, instinctively zoomed in closer, as if even a new history was being written in real time. She was not afraid, not rattled, not reaching for control, because she already held it completely, and when she finally chose to speak, her voice was not loud, but it was lethal. Mr. Levin, I appreciate your passion for constitutional law, but perhaps we should discuss what the Constitution actually says rather than what you think it says. Her tone didn't rise, but its weight dropped like a hammer, and in that moment Mark Levin lost all sense of decorum. What I think it says, he shouted, leaping for his chair, as though wounded by her calm. Lady, I've been studying constitutional law. Since before you were born, I served in the Reagan administration. I've written 5 best-selling books on constitutional principles. Don't you dare lecture me about what the Constitution says. The studio fell into a heavy silence, broken only by Levin's heaving breath. The camera briefly caught Anderson Cooper's tight expression as he gestured slightly to security guards now inching closer, unsure what would happen next. But Crockett still didn't blink. She wore the same quiet smile that unsettled her opponents all evening. 5 books, she repeated slowly, as though the number itself needed to be weighed and documented. That's impressive, Mr. Levin. I've actually read them all. Levin straightened up quickly, the color returning to his face, along with a self-assured smirk. Good, then you should understand why this voting rights bill is completely unconstitutional. Oh, I understand your current position perfectly, Crockett responded with a voice that remained infuriatingly calm. What I'm interested in is how you reconcile that position with what you've previously written in those very